profound gratitude for you um, uh, for your willingness to participate in this, given it's something very informal. There are some specialists that's supposed to join us, archaeologists from Israel, and some art experts and academicians from Russia. I see a couple already here, and we have just random people. It was open to everybody. So even if it's not a necessarily scientific conference, but you, with your expertise and knowledge, is of course as a greatly renowned figure. So I'm very humbled for you accepting my invitation. So and
it was a pleasure. I mean, we had lots of chances to exchange ideas, especially when I went to Novgorod last year, and I was really happy to have the chance to meet in person, although through a computer screen. But I mean, at least we had the possibility to talk to each other. So
right.
Really happy to accept your invitation.
Thank you, Federico, very much. And in a way of personal introduction, this is our first meeting with Dr. Federico Marazzi online. We have been corresponding with him for a little bit, and my love for ancient history and my love for ancient Christian art. Having opportunity to spare some days in Europe, I always go to Italy and always goes to different parts of it where I haven't been and where tourists usually don't go. And I read somewhere, as if by accident, about the crypt chapel of St. Epiphanius and monastery of San Vincenzo al Volturno. And of course, not knowing anything about the monastery, I thought, well, it's a small chapel, and I had big plans. I stopped there for half an hour. Granted, there was Airbnb right next to it. And when I came to see the chapel, all of a sudden I realized the magnitude of the site. Instead of 40 minutes as I planned, I spent there 3 hours, and I was living literally in tears because the site absolutely conquered my imagination and conquered my heart. It's one of the most beautiful archaeological sites that I have been to, and this is definitely one of the sites that I hope to return if Lord ever so will. And I cordially encourage you, if ever you have a chance, to go there and to visit, because site is absolutely stunning. As I was planning a trip to Italy dedicated to ancient Christian art, I wanted to make it very coherent and in-depth. And by doing the research, I came across the name of Dr. Federico Marazzi, who was extremely gracious to reply to my emails and, at least theoretically, to accommodate my request. That trip didn't happen yet, and of course now we all experiencing this pandemic. Nevertheless, through his goodwill and with Lord's blessing, I'm bringing you Dr. Federico Marazzi himself, who is going to talk to us about his archaeological work, research, studies of this most impressive historical site that is just as important to the history of Christian art and architecture as to general historical knowledge in general. So that's in a way of an introduction. Dr. Marazzi, please, I'm passing, so to say, microphone to you.
Thank you so much. I wish to greet everybody whom I don't see, I don't know in person, but I thank you for having been, spending some of your time today listening to my words. First of all, I wish to apologize in advance for not being a mother tongue English speaker. So my English has, of course, many black holes that I will try to fill, and I ask for your comprehension from that point of view. I will share a screen where I will show a PowerPoint with some slides describing the site of San Vincenzo al Volturno. It is not easy to speak about this site in a few, through just a few slides. As Father Ilya said a few minutes ago, it's a place that deserves to be visited in order to understand what it bears, its history, its environment, and its atmosphere as well. But still, I will try my best to give you an overview of this place, and it's a quite unexpected place in history, in European history, in the history of not just Western Christianity, but I would say of Christianity at large. San Vincenzo al Volturno. Now I, pass through the screen. Okay. Hope you can see it. In case there are problems, please give me a hint in through the chat. But I mean, if there's no problem, I will keep going on. San Vincenzo al Volturno, as I was saying, it's a place that lies in one of the least known regions of Italy, the region of Molise. Molise is halfway between Rome and Naples, is one of the smallest Italian regions. Actually, it only hosts a population of 300,000 inhabitants. So a very, very scarcely populated area, which bears a great deal of wilderness still. And San Vincenzo itself lies at the borders of the most ancient Italian national park, the National Park of the Abruzzi, where still a population of bears, of European bears, survives. There are not as many as you have in the American national parks, but still they are a pride of our, park of the Abruzzi. And so therefore the environmental context of the setting of San Vincenzo al Volturno is absolutely superb, because it lies in a landscape that has remained virtually intact through the centuries. There are not big urban settlements in the area around. The only bigger settlement is the city of Isernia, which is the main town that only hosts about 20,000 people. So as you can imagine, we're talking about a small city. And also San Vincenzo al Volturno, San Vincenzo al Volturno's environment is very meaningful, because it explains by itself why it was chosen by the monastic community at the beginning of the 8th century. It was chosen because it bears an extremely favorable environmental context. We are at about 500 meters above the sea level, not far away from the springs of the river Volturno, which you can see here in the picture to the right side of the slide. The river Volturno springs are the biggest springs of fresh water in southern Italy. Therefore, it's an area rich, extremely rich in water, and it's an area which has a very rare availability of flat land, considering that we are in the middle of the Apennines. The Apennines is the chain of mountains that stretches all through the Italian peninsula, and San Vincenzo al Volturno lies in a plateau which was formed a long time ago by the sediments produced by the springs of the river Volturno itself. And this plateau is surrounded by mountains, so it's somehow protected by the cold winds coming from Eastern Europe. I mean, I'm telling you that central Italy and the Apennine area can be extremely cold in the winter, to an extent that people who consider Italy as the land of sunshine would not imagine. But the place where San Vincenzo al Volturno lies has an extremely favorable environmental, meteorological, and climatic conditions, so that it is still possible to cultivate both olive groves and vineyards. And so it's an area that was inhabited since the oldest prehistory. There have been findings of flints dating back to the Paleolithic age, 100,000 years ago. And then it was permanently settled by the Samnites, the population that inhabited this stretch of central Italy before Roman times. Then, when the Roman conquered the region of Samnium, they settled in the plan, building a number of farmsteads, one of which lied exactly where the monastery was afterwards built. And this farmstead lasted until the late Roman period, and possibly hosted a church that was built inside of it during more or less the 5th century AD. And this church attracted a funerary area, an already Christianized funerary area that lasted apparently until the mid-6th century. After that, the area of San Vincenzo al Volturno doesn't show any sign of human presence until the beginning, the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 8th century, when San Vincenzo al Volturno found itself in a very particular situation, since it was at the northern border of the Lombard Duchy of Benevento. As you may know, the Longobards were the population that invaded Italy in 568 AD. They conquered much of Italy, but some of the Italian territory still remained in the hands of the Byzantine Empire, of the East Roman Empire. And central Italy was divided into two main areas: the duchy centered on the city of Spoleto, in nowadays Umbria, and the duchy centered on the city of Benevento, which is in nowadays Campania. San Vincenzo al Volturno lied exactly at the frontier between these two duchies, Spoleto and Benevento, and also at the borders with the region around Rome, which was still in Byzantine hands. So when this area was definitely put under the control of the Duke of Benevento, the Duke of Benevento decided, in order to establish his mastery over the area, to establish a new monastic foundation. We are in a period when the Longobards had definitively converted to Catholicism, and therefore they had become founders of churches and monasteries. Many of them are still very well known. Some of them still bear remains of the Longobards period. And San Vincenzo al Volturno fell under the large number of monastic foundations, about 100 foundations that were created by the Longobards between the late 7th and the first half of the 8th century AD. San Vincenzo al Volturno was protected by the Dukes of Benevento and therefore endowed with a large stretch of land laying around the abbey. The abbey finds itself here. And as you can see, the position where San Vincenzo finds itself is not far from the so-called Terra Sancti Benedicti, the land of Saint Benedict, at the center of which was the monastery of Monte Cassino, which you all, I bet, know, which was founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, which was apparently destroyed by the Longobards at the end of the 6th century, and then was newly born during the 720s, thanks again to the help of the Duke of Benevento, the same Duke who had promoted the foundation of San Vincenzo al Volturno, and the rebirth of Monte Cassino was helped by the already existing community of San Vincenzo al Volturno. The two abbeys, San Vincenzo and Monte Cassino, were like two sister communities, and their history goes hands in hands, at least until the 11th century, the late 11th century, when Monte Cassino was still flourishing, whereas San Vincenzo al Volturno was beginning to decline. And eventually, in the year 699, Monte Cassino bought San Vincenzo al Volturno, and San Vincenzo al Volturno became part of the patrimony, of the landed patrimony, of the landed estates of Monte Cassino. San Vincenzo al Volturno, it's, as was said by Father Ilian at the beginning, has been one of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries in European medieval archaeology during the 20th century. Why was that? San Vincenzo al Volturno, as I said before, is not a unique place in Italy, since we know many monasteries, many other monastic sites funded by the Longobards in the period when they controlled almost the entire Italian peninsula. Nor San Vincenzo was the only Longobard abbey that fell under the protection of the Carolingian kings once they conquered Italy in 774. We know other sites such as San Vincenzo, not just Monte Cassino, but also if you consider the monasteries such as Farfa or San Clemente a Casauria, or Nonantola, or Sant'Ambrogio in Milan, or Sesto al Reghera in Friuli, or San Salvatore in Brescia. I could quote many other monastic sites which became relevant not just in the Longobard, but also in the Carolingian period. But the problem with these other places, as much as with many of the other great monasteries of Western Europe, which had their beginnings in the early medieval period, is that they have been constantly transformed and rebuilt until the modern age, until, you know, the 16th, 17th, 18th century. Some of them have been abolished during the French Revolution of the end of the 18th century, and they were therefore dismantled, but they had been largely modified from what was their original appearance in the early Middle Ages. San Vincenzo al Volturno instead is to be considered as a unique case of an early medieval monastery which is still visible as it used to be in this very early period. Since at the beginning of the 12th century, the monks abandoned the early medieval settlement, which laid here on the western bank of the River Volturno, and they decided to move to the other side, okay, where they built a new born monastery, a fortified monastery, which lasted until, you know, the modern age, was when, as I said before, San Vincenzo ended its independent life and became part of the monastic patrimony of Monte Cassino. Therefore, that means that the early medieval site, although dismantled by the monks at the beginning of the 12th century, has remained undisturbed until present times, which means that every single inch of its ground that we can explore from an archaeological point of view gives back the possibility of discovering how a great monastery had been conceived and built and materially, existed during what's considered at the same time one of the most glorious periods of Western monasticism, but also at the same time one of the less well-known periods of Western Christian monasticism from the material point of view. San Vincenzo al Volturno, as I said before, began even more important when Charlemagne conquered Italy in 774, since it found itself at the southern border of the Carolingian Empire. Therefore, San Vincenzo al Volturno was was basically marking, together with Monte Cassino, the passage between what was directly under the control, under the rule of Charlemagne and his successors, and what Charlemagne decided not to conquer. That is to say, the territory of the Duchy of Benevento, which is this white area that I am pointing at, because Charlemagne decided to leave a sort of buffer zone between his domains and what remained of the Byzantine presence in southern Italy. So the Duchy of Benevento, which became the Principality of Benevento at the end of the 8th century, was basically a sort of buffer zone. That's exactly what it was, between the two great Christian superpowers of the early Middle Ages, the Frankish Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. the Frankish Empire, which considered itself as the newly born Western Roman Empire, and the Eastern Roman Empire that remained the follower of the, so to speak, real Roman Empire of late antiquity. So therefore, San Vincenzo al Volturno, finding itself in its position and being given official protection by Charlemagne through a diploma that was issued in year 787, found itself in a very peculiar position that attracted both attention and care, and which meant money and resources, both from the aristocracy of the Principality of Benevento and from the Frankish aristocracy of the areas north of it. That meant that San Vincenzo became an extremely rich monastery, which could develop very much during the decades between the end of the 8th century and the beginning of the 9th, thus reaching a size that is absolutely unconceivable from the point of view of what we think monasteries could be. I mean, we are used to consider monastery as a small and compact settlement, though somehow monumental. But what we are learning to understand through San Vincenzo is that monastery could become actual cities of the faith. Beg your pardon? Is there any problem? I can hear a voice in the background. Okay, I keep going on. What is going on? Anyway, I've been muted. Hello?
Dr. Federico, you okay? You okay? We just
Can I keep going?
Yes, yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay. So San Vincenzo al Volturno was actually a very large settlement. A very large settlement that included several hectares on the ground, and we are only at the moment exploring the very core of it, where we have found some remarkable buildings, such as the main church dedicated to Saint Vincent, which was built between the end of the 8th century and the beginning of the 9th, plus other areas which we found through a series of steps in the investigations. Investigation began at the beginning of the 80s, had a new thrust at the beginning of the 90s, when we found, when we discovered the main church of the monastery. Then a new stage of the exploration began when we started digging the main cloister of the monastery, and we are at the verge of a new phase of the investigation at San Vincenzo al Volturno, since a series of surveys made last year with the drone made it possible for us to understand that south of the main church, as you can see here in the lowest image of the slide, are actually filled up, are packed with still buried remains, including perhaps another church that we are detected through the anomalies that the drone has seen through its camera, its thermal camera that it had mounted on it. So we are possibly facing a new phase of investigation at San Vincenzo al Volturno, and what I'm telling you now is the result of 30 years of investigation on this site, which are already quite unbelievable in terms of results and in terms of monumentality of the remains that we have unburied so far. Actually, we understood that in the beginning, San Vincenzo al Volturno was built in a rather ambitious way, which did not include anyway the presence of the great church. We realized that the monks planned the existence of a great cloister around which a number of buildings were scattered, and the orientation of these buildings is to be found also on the other side of the now existing great main church. But the main church has partially covered these early remains. It was built afterwards. It was built at the height of the power that San Vincenzo al Volturno reached at the very beginning of the 9th century. And the monks during the 9th century had to cope with the position of this building that was placed on a more raised position in order to be visible all over the area. What is very interesting, what we have found out through our investigation, is that the great church of San Vincenzo was not, as we would imagine, a church that was accessible, that was easily accessible from outside the monastery, but it was very far from its entrance that was, had to be near the river Volturno that ran here, as you can see, and it had to be reached through a long series of corridors and paths that basically unfolded themselves inside the area of the monastery. This is extremely interesting. Here you can see, an artist's view of San Vincenzo al Volturno as it should have been in the, in the mid, more or less, of the 9th century. And this was considered to be rather weird in the beginning. Then, comparing San Vincenzo al Volturno with many other early medieval monastic sites all over Europe, we understood that the main abbey church in Carolingian monasteries was not meant to be a church available to, the community of the lay people. It was a church that was reserved for the prayers of the monks, was the enlarged version of what Saint Benedict called the oratorium for the brethren, the oratorium serving the needs of the monastic community. San Vincenzo, therefore, had many other churches which are mentioned by the written sources, and as it happens with other monasteries in early medieval Europe, one of these churches must have served as, into inverted commas, parish church for the people who gathered around the monastery, who served the monastery, and who made, the monastic settlement not, bigger than the monastic community itself, but, being composed by a number of people who were attached to the community, although not being part of it. The servants of the monasteries, what we know from the sources being the artisans, the craftsmen, even the troops that the monastery had at its dependency in order to protect itself. So what we can describe now is what we know so far of this great monastic settlement. And we've got to be ready to change our mind in terms of how this settlement appeared, because in the future, new discoveries can shed new light on how these monasteries was really conceived at large. We now can judge only what we see. So we can cast, our judgment towards what can be considered as a fraction of the entire settlement. So we got to be prepared to, face new and interesting changes in our vision that may also modify profoundly our capability to interpret such a place. And we got to be aware of the fact that nowhere else in Europe we can have such a large view of a settlement of this kind. We know that a great, deal of discoveries have been made in other places that were known as very important monastic communities of Carolingian Europe, such as Saint Gall in Switzerland, or Saint Denis in France, or Corvey in Germany, or Echternach in Luxembourg. I mean, we could keep on, mentioning so many other sites, but none of them could ever be explored with, the availability of free space as San Vincenzo allows us to do. So from now on, I will describe you what we know about Carolingian age, what we know about San Vincenzo in Carolingian age. If we have time enough, and Father Ilya will tell me so, We can go into, you know, a series of comparisons between San Vincenzo al Volturno and other monastic sites in Europe, and eventually to describe what San Vincenzo became in the year, around year 1000. Because San Vincenzo al Volturno, we have to say this, was destroyed by the Arabs in 881. The Arabs were extremely present and dangerous in southern Italy during the second half of the 9th century. This basically meant a great stop for the life of the monastic community, whose home was set on fire, was ravaged, was sacked, and had to be abandoned by the monks after that dreadful day. But also it kept for the archaeologists of the future even a greater opportunity to unseal the deepest layer of the site dating back to the 8th and the 9th century, which is what we've been mainly focusing on. But we have a later phase of recovery that San Vincenzo met in the late 10th and 11th century, which is again very interesting to study because it's linked to the reappearance of the imperial power in Italy during the late 10th century. And this happened before the monks decided, as I said before, to move to the other side of the river. The Church of San Vincenzo Maggiore, or the Basilica Major, as it is called by the Chronicle of San Vincenzo, that tells us a lot about the history of the monastery between its foundation and the 12th century, gives us an impression of what an imperial abbey had to be in the Carolingian period. We are facing one of the biggest European churches discovered so far. We're talking about a church 65 meters long and nearly 30 meters wide. So we're talking about a church that was built with a, you know, respecting a module of where, you know, the width was 1/2 of the length. So a module, I don't know how you say that in English, 1, 2, 2. We say uno a due in Italian. So you know, the length was the double of the width of the church. And this proportion was very unusual in the early medieval times, because it implied that the width of the main nave of the church was remarkable, and this implied at its turn that the roofing had to be a very complicated affair. The only a place where craftsmen of the highest competence and you know, operational level could face. So it is a very unique church, a church that imitates in its proportions some of the most well-known examples of the early Carolingian Christian architecture. I mean, we can compare easily San Vincenzo with the Abbey Church of Saint Denis, which was built by King Pepin, the father of Charlemagne, and was completed by Charlemagne itself in his early years, or the Abbey of St. Emmeram in Regensburg, which is an extremely important early Carolingian foundation, again dating to the late 8th century. The proportions of the main church of San Vincenzo al Volturno, as we have rebuilt them, collecting all the archaeological evidence we dispose of, it's that of a church that resembled the great basilicas of late antiquity, and which had a very great similarity in particular with the most important Roman basilicas of late antiquity, including the fact that its apsidal area was oriented to the west, such as St. Peter's, such as St. John in Rome, which is a very rare feature, but which made San Vincenzo in a way very close in its atmosphere and its appearance to the greatest imperial basilicas of Rome, built at the time of Constantine. But this was not by chance, because San Vincenzo al Volturno had to reflect the importance and the power of its patron, which was Charlemagne itself, in a way, by issuing his privilege in 787, which granted San Vincenzo his mundiburdium, which means protection in early Frankish language. Charlemagne declared San Vincenzo al Volturno one of his more delighted places throughout the empire, and a place that moreover had to be an eye that Charlemagne could, through San Vincenzo, cast beyond the border of his empire towards the Byzantine world. So San Vincenzo al Volturno has to be like a window shop for the Carolingian Empire, has to be a place where the greatness that the Carolingian Empire had reached could be admired also by those who came from outside. And what is very interesting is that even if we compare San Vincenzo al Volturno with Monte Cassino, which was on the same border area as San Vincenzo al Volturno, we find that San Vincenzo al Volturno was far more monumental and magnificent than Monte Cassino, perhaps because it found itself on the main itinerary that linked southern Italy with central and northern Italy, passing through the Apennines. What is now a secondary road in the geography of present-day Italy used to be instead one of the main roads linking different parts of peninsular Italy in the early Middle Ages, which perhaps justifies why San Vincenzo was built at such an ambitious level by his monks during the 8th century and the 9th century. And what is very interesting in terms of imitation that San Vincenzo wanted to pursue vis-a-vis the models of early Christian architecture is the crypt that was found below the presbyterial area of the main church. This crypt is a very close imitation of the crypt that was built by Pope Gregory the Great at the end of the 6th century under the Church of St. Peter's in Rome. So through the discoveries we made at San Vincenzo al Volturno, we can understand exactly how the early crypt that hosted the relics of St. Peter's had been conceived and built in practice by the popes at the end of the 6th century. And it also helps us to understand better the spread of annular crypt. This is how they are called, due to the curving corridor that follows the shape of the main apse, how to better understand other annular crypt that were built elsewhere in Carolingian Europe, still imitating, having as a main model of reference, as a main point of reference, the crypt of St. Peter's in Rome, which you can see here marked by number 1 in this illustration. San Vincenzo al Volturno was not just, of course, a great church, although this building was certainly the most remarkable feature throughout the monastery. But San Vincenzo was a great organism that was meant to protect and shelter the life of a monastic community. So their praying activity, their chanting activity, the praise of God that they had to carry on every day, but also a place where, in order to keep this reputation and this dignity as high as it was possible, a framework of greatness and a number of siding activity had to be granted. So we see the same care, the same careful attention for details, for decoration, for embellishing throughout all the buildings that San Vincenzo was made of. Here you can see a view of the northern part of the great cloister that we have partially dug in the early years 2000. And you can see here the corridor flanking the refectory that was behind this wall. You see in the perspective, you see the main church. that was reached by a staircase that allowed the entrance from its northern side, because before the facade of the church, an area populated by workshop was placed, working for, you know, all in order to product all the objects and all the materials that were needed in the builder's yard. The monastery was made of in this very, you know, effervescent period between the 8th and the 9th century. Here you can see the reconstruction of the lavatorium, which was a building when the monastery used to go before entering the refectory in order to wash their hands and face, and to, you know, enter properly clean the refectory for, you know, having their meals. And here you have the reconstruction, which are based on sound archaeological data of other areas of the monastery as they used to be in the 9th century. Here you see the so-called prophet's room, facing as well the great cloister, which was like a vestibule linking the cloister itself with the refectory, whose entrance was on its left side, and whose walls were painted with a number of portraits depicting prophets. Each one of them held scrolls with, you know, passages of their you know, texts of their prophecies, which we found almost intact, although collapsed, in a very lucky excavations campaign at the beginning of the 80s. Then below you can see the refectory, which has been found almost intact in its perimeter. Unfortunately, all the elevation has gone lost, but we could rebuild some of its features thanks to the traces that we found on the ground. The refectory was the biggest space so far discovered in San Vincenzo al Volturno after the main church. So reassessing the importance of the refectory as the main communitarian space after the church, the refectory was a place that was as forbidden to those who came from the outside as the church was. The refectory was one of the places where the identity of a community, their traditions, their way of life displayed itself every day. And we could recognize that this big rectangular room, this big rectangular building was a refectory, because we found the pulpit at the very end of it on its western side. Then here you can see a reconstruction of the kitchens, of the monastic kitchens, located just beside the refectory. This has been another exceptional discovery we made in San Vincenzo, not just because we found the kilns and you know, the fireplace where where food was cooked, but because we found several remains of food itself, giving us lots of interesting information about what monks actually ate every day. And so making it possible for us to make comparisons between what the rules said and what they actually did every day. Plus, we found even more evidences of what was eaten in the monastery, close to the monastic refectory, but near a room that was perhaps used by guests that were welcomed in the monastic precinct. And what is absolutely striking is the huge difference between what was offered to the monks every day and what was offered to the guests. Then if we have time afterwards, I will be glad to answer some questions from that point of view on this very topic, because it is absolutely intriguing to you know, discover this world of edible things that we found by digging the kitchens, the refectory, and the guests' refectory. But I want to hurry up in order to present you with the entire, you know, the entire framework of San Vincenzo al Volturno. Eventually, you can see here what it's called the garden court, which is an open space surrounded by two porches, which resembles a Roman peristyle, basically a space that you would easily find in a house in Pompeii. On its right side, you can see the refectory. On the left side, you see the church, perhaps called Santa Maria, Saint Mary by the river, which is one of the churches, one of the 9 churches existing inside the monastic settlement. And you can see that in the middle, a huge marble base was located, which is an absolutely exceptional object, because the only other object which can be compared to it was found in the villa of Hadrian near Tivoli, near Rome, a place that you all know, one of the most important imperial residences of the Roman Empire, which tells us how careful the monks were in terms of choosing what had to be brought to the monastery in order to make it more astonishing from an aesthetic point of view. Then we go, you see, this is the refectory, this is the garden court, this is the Church of St. Mary by the river. Then we go down to this other small chapel, which hosts one of the most important things that San Vincenzo has, you know, kept for such a long period of time. One of the, perhaps the most important, most famous treasure that San Vincenzo has given back to us after so many centuries. This church is called the Crypt Church, has been called the Crypt Church, because it hosts a triconch hypogean space, which is superimposed by another similar space, which is, as you can see, a sort of triconch apse, which finds itself on a higher, at a higher level in comparison to the nave of the small church. Perhaps this is the readaptation of a late Roman church, the church that was placed into the Roman villa and which worked as a funerary chapel for the villa when its population was Christianized, converted to Christianism at the end of antiquity. During the early 9th century, this space was refurbished by Abbot Epiphanius, whose portrait is, you know, very well visible inside the chapel, and it was basically entirely painted and decorated by a cycle of frescoes, which is one of the treasures of European early medieval painting, because it is one of the few places where we cannot just see how artists worked, but we can also understand how a pictorial cycle was conceived and put into practice in early medieval times. So we have the possibility to interpret the entire iconographic conception that was behind the making of this pictorial cycle. This is, although it represents perhaps the gem of the art treasures that San Vincenzo al Volturno has produced through the years, it used to be just a small chapel inside the monastery. So from this tiny place, we can imagine how splendid the great churches of San Vincenzo should have been in the same period. And we therefore regret how much is gone lost, although through the excavation, hundreds of thousands of painted fragments have been found, and the possibility of recovering parts of the decoration, at least of the main church, is at hand. If, I mean, as we used to have in the past decades, there will be in the future again the resources to keep on going with this kind of activity. Anyway, the crypt of Epiphanius is extremely interesting because it's a funerary chapel. I mean, there was a tomb at its eastern end, where perhaps not a proper body was buried, but perhaps relics were, you know, sheltered, and its presence had determined the meaning of the entire cycle of frescoes, where life after death, it's explained from a Christian point of view. I mean, when you enter, you are faced with an only opening that lets natural light, let sunlight enter this cave, basically, this semi-artificial cave. And above this window, the painters put an hand, which is the hand of God, which symbolizes the entering of the light of the revelation into the darkness of the after death. And the revelation of God through the ministry of Christ explains to the faithful that death is not the end of everything, but it's the beginning of something else, which is real life. Actually, you may know that the birthday of Christian martyrs, what in Latin used to be said the dies natalis, was considered to be the day when they died, because that was the day when they would have started their real life in front of the light of God. So actually, this hand, it's a symbolic opening of a new world where the revelation of Christ and the promise of salvation is put on display. On one hand of the crypt, the stories of Christ are presented, as you can see, the Annunciation, the baptism, and the washing of Christ's body, which is very interesting because it's an episode which is not taken from the 4 canonic gospel, but it's taken from one of the apocryph gospels. And then the majesty of Virgin Mary dressed as a Byzantine empress, keeping the small child, Jesus as a small child, but dressed as a Roman senator, holding in his hand the scroll of the new pact that will be subscribed between God and the human race, thanks to the incarnation of Christ on this world. Then you can see the whole story ends up with the crucifixion of God, at the foot of which is the portrait of Epiphanius, and then the resurrection of Christ, represented at the moment when the 3 Marys came to the tomb of Christ and found it already opened and devoid, and the angel guarding it and telling them that the Savior had already left this world and had already been, vindicated from the shame of having been crucified. And the other sides of the crypt of Epiphanius tell us about what happens afterwards. It tells us about the witnessing of faith by the followers of Christ. They became all brothers of Christ through the last words that Christ pronounced on the cross when he declared John as his disciple, his brother, and therefore another virtual son of Virgin Mary, so that every Christian faithful is virtually a brother of Christ in the light of these words. And therefore all the followers are the witnesses, the witnesses of the faith, that they can witness up to the extreme sacrifice of their life. You know that the word martyr in Greek is a neutral word, is a word that means witness, whereas now we use the word martyr as someone who, in order to witness his or her faith, sacrifices his own life. So actually, this is the meaning that the word martyr took in the Christian, in light of the Christian, interpretation of what a martyr should be. And eventually, the crypt represents the end of times, when Jesus Christ will come back in order to establish who will be saved and who will be not, who has been following his teaching, who is been instead ignoring them and will be therefore condemned to the eternal pain of hell. And Jesus Christ this time is not anymore the pious God that sacrifices himself on the cross, but is a pure spirit coming back in order to take account of what's been happening on this earth after he's left is left it to go back to his father, and he's accompanied by the heavenly troops of the 4 archangels who are siding him, who are folding up the stars, who are turning off the stars, folding up the skies, and waiting for the moment when all the souls will be claimed by Jesus Christ and judged. But what is very interesting is that the painter has superimposed a new portrait of Virgin Mary, again dressed as Queen of Heaven, holding the book, bearing the first words of the Magnificat. As you know, the Magnificat is the chant of glory reported by the Gospel of Luke, where Virgin Mary praises, in a way, herself as the bearer of God, who's made himself human, and therefore is at the same time a celestial creature and an earthly person who has been chosen in order to make this miracle possible. And therefore, Mary is the only person who can tell Jesus Christ, having given birth to him as a man, as a human, to be merciful at the moment of the last judgment, because having been human, he knows how humans can be weak. And therefore, he's got to be fair, but not ruthless in judging people who will be submitted to his final evaluation. This is very interesting because this comes right from an interpretation of the Apocalypse of St. John that was given by a theologian, Ambrosius Autpertus, who was as well first monk and then abbot of San Vincenzo al Volturno at the end of the 8th century. So therefore, here we have a perfect connection between the theological work that was carried out at San Vincenzo al Volturno and its translation into images. I mean, we could spend ages talking about the paintings in the Crypt of Epiphanius, their style, their influences, but I mean, we'll take again, not just, I've already been speaking for about an hour. I don't want to abuse of your time. So I will just finish up by telling you a few more details about the topography and of this abbey, of this monastery, and what we found through the excavations, because the Crypt of Epiphanius certainly is one of the most striking places you can imagine for, you know, meeting early medieval art, but it's not the only striking thing that we have found through the excavation. What I was telling you before is that we had the chance to dig in the area between the monastic buildings and the river that ran, you know, close to the abbey, the river Volturno. This is why the abbey is called San Vincenzo al Volturno. Now, the river Volturno is a tiny creek. Since its water, it's mostly deviated by in order to serve a power station that was built at the beginning of the 20th century. So therefore, that means that there's a tiny fraction of the water that used to run by the abbey, and which made this abbey. There's a message. Sorry, I want to. No. The crypt has survived intact. Nothing has been preserved. It was. I mean, sorry. I just you know take the license to tell you a few details about how it was found. In year 832, a peasant was digging up his field in order to make holes where to plant a vineyard. At a certain point, the ground collapsed below his feet, and he was, you know, and he fell into a cave. He looked around himself and he realized that it was not a natural cave, but it was a completely painted place. And that was the Crypt of Epiphanius that had been buried underground, and it was found just by chance at the beginning of the 19th century. And there are the reports written by the how do you say, the priest of the village nearby, who wrote to the abbot of Monte Cassino, telling him, look, we found something absolutely amazing. The abbot of Monte Cassino came a couple of years after, made an even longer report, which remained buried into the archives of Monte Cassino for about 70 years, until at the end of the 19th century, eventually this discovery became, you know, widespread and well known over the world through the work of two main art historians, Émile Berthaud, a French art historian who died very young in World War I, but who at the time, before to finish his masterpiece work, L'art dans l'Italie méridionale, l'art du Moyen Âge dans l'Italie méridionale, that means early medieval art in southern Italy. And the second art historian was Pietro Toesca, who was an art historian who wrote the first great synthesis of Italian art in the Middle Ages. So they made some, like the crypt of Epiphanius, you know, known worldwide, first among the art historians, and then among, you know, connoisseurs and amateurs of art more in general. Going back to the excavations by the river, we had the chance so to understand how wide was the river. I mean, at least we could appreciate that it was at least 3 times as wide as it is now, considering that we have not reached the opposite side of the river. We could make these excavations in a moment when the power station at the spring of the Volturno was under restoration. So a big tube was inserted into the riverbed of the Volturno, and the area around was, you know, left dry and possible, you know, to be approached by the archaeologists. And we found an amazing, you know, amazing remains of the wooden pier that was built, you know, just before the buildings that faced the river, something which is extremely difficult to find at our latitudes. Normally you find such things in Scandinavia or in the British Isles, where the nature of the ground is completely different from that of Mediterranean regions. And behind that, we found the place that I was telling you about before, which we interpreted as the refectory for the guests, for the monastic guests. Actually, as I was saying before, the excavations at San Vincenzo had allowed us to understand how rich and flourishing were the workshops, the workshops that existing in San Vincenzo, whose task was that of embellishing the monastery in its different aspects, in its different parts. And so we had a wide range of objects of sculpture, and we have an amazing catalog of Roman sculpture reused within the monastic buildings. As you can see, you know, capitals, lintels, the pieces of the marble vase I was telling you before, put at the middle of the garden court, sarcophagi, inscriptions, all sorts of objects that were absolutely scattered everywhere in the monastery, letting us understand how flourishing was the market of used Roman sculpture in what we call the Dark Ages, which were not at all Dark Ages for those who could afford to approach the market of objects of this artistic relevance. As well, we understood from the excavations how widespread was the presence of paintings. It was virtually everywhere, not just inside of churches, but basically we've found remains of paintings, as I said before to you, in the room near the refectory, in the refectory itself, in a small vestibule preceding the so-called rooms of the prophets, from which this portrait of a young saint comes. And then we have experienced that there were several phases of paintings and repaintings. For example, the paintings you see in the lower range in this slide are from the later phase of San Vincenzo Maggiore, of the main church, when it was rebuilt at the end of the 11th, at the end, sorry, of the 10th, beginning of the 11th century. And they represent a very, very rare example of pre-Romanesque, we would call Ottonian phase, from the dynasty of the Ottonian emperors, which reigned the Western Empire between the end of the 10th and the first half of the 11th century, of the Ottonian phase paintings in Italy. It's extremely interesting that they come from an area near the main church where all these paintings were hacked off the stones of the main church when it was demolished, in order to reuse its stones in the church that was going to be rebuilt on the other side of the river. But San Vincenzo has been extremely generous to archaeologists, also in terms of objects of metallurgy, of enamel working. You see here a book cover, a plaquette being part of a case, of a relic case perhaps, a flower made in metal, which whose use we do not exactly understand, knives, lamps, suspenders, an iron cross, and another aspect which is very interesting of the level of refinement that San Vincenzo al Volturno reached at its zenith during the 9th century was the widespread use of glass. I mean, virtually every building had window glasses. I mean, had windows protected by glasses, which is something which is absolutely exceptional for, you know, European early Middle Ages. We also found this amazing small piece of window glass depicting the bust of Christ. This is the earliest ever found piece of figurative glass found in Europe. So it's an absolutely remarkable piece of archaeology. And also what was very popular among the monks was the use of glass beakers that were perhaps used both for liturgical and for more profane purposes. What is also extremely important for the archaeologists, this is an extremely important aspect of the excavations at San Vincenzo al Volturno, is the abundance of pottery, both in terms of number of objects and in terms of variety of shapes, including many examples of pietra ollare recipients. You know, pietra ollare is called soapstone in English. It's a type of stone that was carved in the Alps, and it's one of the few type of objects that traveled very far in the early Middle Ages. I mean, in Roman period, we have lots and lots of types of potteries that traveled far distances in order to reach markets and consumers of all sorts. In the early Middle Ages, this is not so common, but pietra ollare makes an exception from that point of view, although it's not properly speaking a pottery, but it's stone used as pottery for, you know, its properties in terms of heating food inside of it. As you can see, recipients in pietra ollare were very carefully used. They were repaired when they crashed. You see these lead grips that were used in order to put back together fragments of a vase that had collapsed, broken, perhaps it fell onto the ground. But what is very interesting is that San Vincenzo al Volturno, being a great producer of, you know, being a great producer of agricultural surplus. I mean, you must consider San Vincenzo al Volturno has property scattered all over southern Italy. So its estates produced much more than what the monastic community could use. It had the chance to approach widespread, you know, far-reaching markets. San Vincenzo al Volturno, as all the other main Italian monasteries, located its antennas, I mean its properties by the main river mouths and the main coastal lakes of Italy. And it was not by chance. It happened not just because San Vincenzo al Volturno, as much as Monte Cassino, as other important Italian abbeys of the time, were interested in fisheries, for example, but also because these places were landing points for boats who traveled far and who were interested in trading goods. San Vincenzo al Volturno exchanged agricultural surplus, timber, in exchange of receiving in exchange goods that were not common in Europe at that time, goods that came from very far, brought by from the first generation of merchants from Venice or from Gaeta, from Amalfi, from Naples, from the city that, remaining under the umbrella of the Byzantine Empire, acted as free merchants in the within the framework of Carolingian Italy, also allowing imported goods to travel very far into Central and Northern Europe. As much as another way of importing goods from the rich lands of the Byzantine and the Arabic world was the way made by Vikings, by Swedish Vikings through Russian rivers. I mean, Father Ilya knows that very well. I mean, knowing Novgorod and its wonderful archaeological discoveries, but in places such as Novgorod, we find Arabic and Byzantine coins in great quantities, as much as we find them even in Sweden, from the same period as, you know, from the same period as that we are now examining for, you know, what concerns San Vincenzo. San Vincenzo was more or less the same thing insofar was capable of boosting commercial activities that were materially led by the merchant cities of the Byzantine areas of Italy. And in this slide, you see objects coming from everywhere in the world. I mean, you see a bronze plaquette, a bronze circular plaquette coming from the British Isles, being from Scotland actually, being part of a bronze vase that was brought by San Vincenzo, I don't know, God knows who, a monk traveling from Northern Europe, perhaps. Or you can see here another piece of, you know, orfebrerie, of jewelry, made in Central Europe, and they were part of a horse garments, basically. Here you can see fragments of gilded glass coming from Mesopotamia, from modern Iraq. Here you see an object that was carved in San Vincenzo, but whose raw material came from Africa. We're dealing with hippopotamus ivory. Here you see a weight, you know, a scale weight with Greek letters coming from, you know, Byzantine areas. And this is perhaps the most exceptional object. This is part of a ceremonial, sword. Is the upper part of the handle of a ceremonial sword made of jade, arriving from China. So these things travel very far and arrive to San Vincenzo together, for example, with colors. I mean, when we have examined the pigments that were used in the crypt of Epiphanius, we realized that much of them, some of them, sorry, came from Eastern Mediterranean, such as the lapis lazuli, for example, or the glass that was worked in San Vincenzo came, was not entirely produced in San Vincenzo, but came to San Vincenzo, arrived to San Vincenzo as already, it arrived in half-worked, as a half-worked matter. I don't know if you say that in English, like gold, you know, when raw gold is made into bars, basically. I can't remember what exactly the English word is for that, but basically the glass was sent under the same shape from the east to the west. And we have, through chemical analysis, we have found out that the glass that was used in San Vincenzo originally came from Palestine, from modern day Israel. So, I mean, we're talking about early Middle Ages, but we understand that we are talking about, so the period when Western Europe had fallen to its lowest, peak in a way after the fall of the Roman Empire. But we can understand also that European society was reorganizing itself, was very sharply organized into a pyramidal shape, at whose peak there was a very small cluster of lay and clergy aristocracy, which ran the entire Carolingian Empire, and which could afford to revive a lifestyle that we used to consider as lost after the fall of the Roman Empire. Well, it's 7:15 here. I guess it's 1:15 in the United States. I think I used a lot of your time, so I can stop myself here. I would be, of course, glad to answer your questions if you have any to submit, and I'm thankful for your attention. You've been dedicating great deal of time following my presentation. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm open to your questions, of course.
Dr. Marazzi, thank you so much. It's absolutely amazing presentation. I feel like I relived it all, and just begin to hyperventilate because I do want to go back. The finds that you discovered during the excavations and such, are they in the museum or in the storage? Is it possible to see them?
Actually, the most important finds are on display at the Archaeological Museum in the city of Venafro, which is some 30 kilometers away from San Vincenzo al Volturno. It's a pretty city, rich in Roman and medieval and post-medieval monuments, which also hosts a very nice archaeological museum. And one section of it is devoted to the finds from San Vincenzo.
Oh, wonderful. I do have some quick questions because I see questions already beginning to come up. Some very basic layman questions were sent to me in anticipation, and something that I also wanted to ask. At the zenith of the monastery, what was estimated population? And when you said about the surplus of agricultural products and timber and everything else, were all of that produced by monks as ora et labora, or did they use hired help?
So first question, we can only guess the overall population of the monastic community by calculating how many people could sit in the refectory. We've made this calculation, and we understand that inside the refectory there was room for between 250 and 300 people. First. Secondly, the monks scarcely engaged themselves with manual, peasant work. The prestigious communities as such of San Vincenzo al Volturno were not anymore practicing ora et labora in the sense that Saint Benedict thought of. I mean, they were an aristocracy from all points of view. They devoted themselves to activities such as copying manuscripts, writing, chanting, supervising the activities of craftsmen who were hired by the monks in order to produce what they needed. Perhaps some of the monks were capable of being, good craftsmen. Some of them might have been painters, Some of them might have been sculptors. We don't know exactly that, but certainly the monks of San Vincenzo were not peasants anymore. They could have enjoyed working in the gardens of the monastery. They could have enjoyed, I mean, we have, for example, a text from the Frankish monastery of Corbie in northern France that tells us the monastery could enjoy working in the orchard of the monastery, but not in the fields. Also because it was considered as inappropriate to let monks, wander freely around the monastery outside the cloister, whereas the orchards or the gardens were within the perimeter of the monastery. And even there, they were helped by servants. So monks in the Carolingian times, especially those who lived in places like San Vincenzo al Volturno, were not anymore manual workers in the romantic sense that we attribute to what Saint Benedict had in mind. They led a life that was considered, that could be even quite hard. I mean, I'm not saying that writing in a scriptorium under the light of a candle and writing over a parchment was a light kind of work, but it was a more specialized type of work. And monks were specialized people, so they were rather used for this type of mansions, for this type of activities.
Dr. Marazzi, questions that I just received. On the map, there is an indication of the dormitorium, but where they actually discovered, and also where the monastic cemetery discovered or not.
Okay, the dormitorium, I assume that, but we not found it. Okay, I go back to the presentation if you let me do so, because it makes things easier. We think, you see, we have found a staircase coming from the hill besides the main church and pointing straight to the main entrance to the church, that light on the northern side of the church, exactly midway between the facade and the apse. Okay, so it was a strategically placed entrance, was a main entrance to the church, and it comes from the hill above. Below, around the church, we've not detected any space that could be identified as a dormitory. Okay, so the only possibility is, since the monks had to go to church in the middle of the night, I mean, they had to pray at night, they had to go twice to church to pray at night, which is another aspect that made monks' life quite harsh, if you think of. I mean, who among us would like to be waken up twice in the night? I mean, especially in the middle of the winter when it's very cold. I mean, I can tell you, I've been living there for many years in a house that had no heating. And so I can tell you that it's bloody cold in the winter. It's really bad. I mean, so the staircase had to be linked to a place the monks should come and go every day frequently. And what that place could be, I assume that above the hill, besides the church, that was the position of the dormitory. I guess, I mean, I reckon that this is the only logic I can see in place in that staircase where we have found it. So this is for what concerns the first question. Sorry, what was the second question? I can't remember.
Cemetery, monastic cemetery. What's monastic cemetery from?
The monastic cemetery, that is another great question. I must go again to the image we were at. In the early 80s and in a few years ago, we have been making excavations on the highest part of the hill that overlooks the monastery. Okay, there's as you saw in the, I'll show you. Okay, here you can see this is the main church. Okay, this is the main church. This is the hill. that overlooks the monastic site. By digging in this area, which is now densely wooded, we have found traces of a huge funerary area. So it is possible that this area was used as an open air cemetery. By the way, in Monte Cassino, things were organized more or less in the same manner. I don't know if you have ever been to Monte Cassino. If you have, now when you visit the abbey, you go in its and you go to its highest place. You find the main church, which hosts the burial of Saint Benedict. The monastery was not there in the early Middle Ages, was where now it's the entrance to the monastery, so was in a lower position. This upper part, reaching the very peak of the hill, where Saint Benedict established a small chapel dedicated to Saint John the Baptist, became the place where Saint Benedict himself was buried along with his sister, Santa Scholastica, okay, which was used as a huge funerary area that lasted until the 11th century, when a number of abbots, ending up with Abbot Desiderius, the great abbot that refurbished completely the monastery of San Vincenzo al Volturno, decided to move the residential part of the monastery by the burial of Saint Benedict, thus putting an end to the widespread funerary use of that part of the hill, which was confined only into a very small space where still the monks are buried at Monte Cassino, by the way. So the hill above San Vincenzo Maggiore could have been the area where we assume that the main monastic cemetery should have been. Although the Chronicon Vulturnense tells us that there was also a church which is described very much into detail, dedicated to Saint Peter, which had the privilege to host the burials of the abbots. We have not yet found this church, but this church had also a crypt into which also the bones of the monks were thrown, and also the bodies of the monks who were slaughtered in 881 by the Arabs were recovered. So we can consider both the possibilities that there used to be in the 9th century an open-air cemetery spreading all over the hill, and that there was also a funerary church, as it used to exist in almost every monastery in early medieval Europe, where privileged burials were gathered. In the 11th century, when the main church was rebuilt and an atrium was built before it, turning this inaccessible church into a real cathedral, because San Vincenzo al Volturno in the 10th, 11th century began to exercise the power of a bishop in the area around. In the atrium of this church, a small cemetery was established, but the community of the residential monks in that period was much smaller, because part of the community used to live in the city of Capua. This later cemetery, we have discovered it in the excavation we did in the early years 2000, and so we know that very well. Still, there are some shades, as I said before, about how the great cemetery of the 9th century was organized.
Mm-hmm.
Someone was asking when do the paintings date? The earliest paintings that we found, the question is from Olga Soroskina, if I read well. The first paintings were made, as far as we know, in the late 8th century.
In the late 8th century. Dr. Marazzi says a question like that. The main basilica, was it completely painted, akin to the later basilica in San Angelo in Formis, or was it just fragmentary in some parts and it's not corresponding to the dating of the basilica and the paintings coming from a bit later period of time?
We believe that was entirely painted.
Entirely painted.
Unfortunately, I mean, we can assume that when it was repainted in the 11th century, it was totally painted. We don't know about the 9th century because there is very little of the original decoration that has survived from the early period. So, but I think so.
I've heard, well, during my visit in Apulia, I visit a tiny church. I may butcher the name of San Banipale. San Banipale, and there are
It's a very important point of reference for analyzing San Vincenzo's paintings.
Yeah, and somebody said that paintings in San Banipale and in Crypt of San Epiphanius, they done in the same style, if not to say by the same master. Can you comment on that?
It's correct. It's correct. We do not have many examples of paintings from this period, but there are 3 places who look very similar to each other from a stylistical point of view. One is Sepannibale that you just mentioned. The other one is San Vincenzo. The third one is the crypt of the original sin near Matera. I think you all know Matera. This wonderful city in Basilicata. Near Matera, there is plenty of caves that were turned into churches in the early Middle Ages, and one in particular has preserved its painted decoration that was absolutely beautiful, whose style resembles very much that of San Vincenzo al Volturno. So there used to be certainly quite a maniera, as we say in Italian, of painting that was shared by different groups of painters. We cannot say they were the same painters, but certainly painters who shared the same aesthetical canons.
There was a question you mentioned about the food and what monks had to eat and what they actually ate, and how do we know what they fed guests and who ate better, guests or the monks?
The way the monks ate would certainly suit better the principles of healthy food that we now prefer. I mean, as you know, monastic diet had to be nearly vegetarian. I mean, 100% vegetarian, and even some of the most extreme conception of monastic diet excluding cooked food, so only raw vegetables, basically. Benedict was not so strict. He allowed, and perhaps this is why his rule was the most successful, he allowed consumption of what we called white meat, so such as chicken or fish or similar animals, you know, seafood, stuff like that. And he allowed the consumption of red meat only for ill or very old brethren. And this was why, this was because red meat was considered as dangerous because it could increase sexual appetites. And therefore was the food for warriors. They were, you know, those who could eat that kind of meat. Monks should abstain from eating that kind of food. Actually, in San Vincenzo, we found a perfect mirror of that. And so far in the kitchens of the monastic kitchens that we dug, I mean, we know for sure that they were the monastic kitchens because they were just, you know, 5 meters away from their factory. They were just besides their factory. We found a huge quantity of vegetables, seeds, telling us that they used to, of legumes as well. So they used to eat lots of cereals, of legumes. We found lots of remains of eggs, of chicken bones, fish bones. And what is very interesting is that we found lots of fish bones belonging to not to freshwater species, but to seawater species, which means that, considering that San Vincenzo is far away from the seaside, but that San Vincenzo owned fisheries along the main coastal lakes of central and southern Italy, it means that there was a regular import of fresh fish from San Vincenzo, from the lakes to the monastery, which is very interesting considering that it took days to bring things from the coasts of Campania or the coasts of Apulia to San Vincenzo al Volturno. So we are asking ourselves how they did so, how they could keep fresh fish from its source to the monastery without making it rot. The fish that we found, the sea fish we found, is mainly fish that is suitable for soups, for broth, such as sharks, eels, very fat fish, so to speak, that it was not so good to eat, but was rather good in order to make broth, basically, to make soups. We found lots of fruits. What is interesting is that the fruits that we found from the latest bunch of refusals that we dug in terms of timing that we found excavating the kitchen, was made mainly of fruits that are consumed during autumn, such as figs, grapes, nuts, stuff like that. And that is the last supper of the monks, because after that, the monks was attacked and razed to the ground by the Arabs. And it's very interesting that there is a perfect correspondence between what the chronicle says and what the archaeologist has told us. Because the chronicle says that San Vincenzo al Volturno was sacked on October the 10th, a period where this kind of fruit is available. So there's a perfect coherence between written and material evidence. And whereas when we have been digging the layers of lime, of silt that had deposited below what we call the distinguished guest refectory, which is a few meters away from the monastic kitchen, we found a completely different horizon. We found all sorts of food that were not at all witnessed, but what we found in the kitchen. So it was a completely different type of menu. There were game, such deers, horse, rabbits, even bears. We know that also bear was considered as an edible type of animal. And we found all sorts of fish of high quality. I cannot translate names of fish in English, you must excuse me. It's very difficult. One I remember is bass, for example. All sorts of fish with very delicate type of meat, fish that when you go to buy it today at the fishery, you paid highly. I mean, it's fish of good quality. Instead, the fish that was found in the kitchen, in the monk's kitchen, was a completely different type of fish, as I said before. And also small birds, for example, pheasants. There's another type of bird whose name I cannot remember in English now. Sparrows, for example. Sparrows were, they were used in order to embellish cakes. They were made into candies. It's weird. I mean, things I didn't know. I learned it when colleagues of mine have been studying these animal remains. I mean, so that all sorts of amazing tortoise, for example, lobsters. This kind of stuff doesn't show in the monastic kitchen's remains. So there must have been another kitchen that used to cook this kind of delicatessen, which we have not yet located.
So we could say that it was a VIP monastery with a lot of VIP guests.
Absolutely. I mean, if you know the parchment plan of Saint Gall, the famous plan of a virtual monastery, which was drawn at the beginning of the 9th century, it shows very well how the monks held in an extremely high position distinguished visitors. It was a quarter for distinguished visitors that was provided with single bed rooms, with latrines, with lounges and stuff like that, whereas normal visitors, humble pilgrims, had to be gathered into common rooms where they could sleep on straws. They had to cook food by themselves, whereas the distinguished guests had their own cookers, people who cooked for them, cooked good stuff for them. I mean, we know that from the remains that we found in San Vincenzo and Monte Cassino, it was exactly the same thing as it is witnessed by the written sources. Monks were, charitable, but they could exercise different type of charity.
So I've heard, I have not witnessed as a curiosity, that in one of monasteries in Russia, as that was just recently restored, they had a special guest room for a VIP sponsor with a jacuzzi built in. And somebody said
Yes.
it's absolutely unprecedented. So now we could say that there were precedents in history like that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
All right. A question came, is there any website or publications on the surviving frescoes, in particular in the Chapel of St. Epiphanius, but also whatever you found in the major basilica?
The frescoes, there's an internet site that we have not updated for a long time. Alas, I must confess, this is one, but you can still find quite a few good pictures, which is San Vincenzo al Volturno.it. Pictures from the crypt of Epiphanius, you can find them in the internet everywhere. That is not a problem. You can also find quite a few pictures of the paintings found in the crypt of the main basilica. They are available because they've been published several times. So that is not a problem. We should update the site. This is a sin that will pay in the afterlife.
If I remember correctly, the frescoes in the main crypt in the Basilica Major, they were not accessible some years back. They were closed.
They still are inaccessible because they have problems of exposition to weather, so they had to be kept protected. Unfortunately, the management of the site is not under my responsibility. I know that now the Italian Ministry of Culture is about to develop a program in order to renew completely all the coverings of the site, and I hope that with this, this problem too will be solved. I hope so, at least.
Mm-hmm. The question came, supposedly the available pictures, they're mainly from the frescoes of the 9th century. And you mentioned that there were some from the 8th as well. Were those...
Actually, some of the paintings that we found, such as the prophets, they are dated between the end of the 8th and the beginning of the 9th century. Actually, I take the opportunity to say that we have a big problem in San Vincenzo. And the problem is that we have practically no material evidence of the earliest phase of the monastery. Through the surveys that we made with the drone last year, we have detected an area where we can see buildings that have an orientation that is completely different from that of the later buildings, both of the late 8th century and of the 11th century, of the 9th and then of the 11th century. And these buildings have the same orientation as the late Roman and have the same orientation of the late Roman buildings, and possibly one of these buildings is a church. If we ever have the chance to dig there, I presume that we have detected where the original monastery was. and perhaps we can understand how the monastery looked like in its earlier phase. This is why we don't have anything very early from the earliest phases of the monastic life at San Vincenzo al Volturno.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, do you have any other questions? Please, you could send them to me or directly to Dr. Marazzi, please.
Is the painting medium egg tempera? I'm not the person to ask on this topic, because I'm not a specialist on the chemistry of paintings. Actually, there has been lots of publication dealing with this topic. I know that it's a technique that follows exactly the way the Romans worked. So if you know that, you may draw the conclusion. But I don't want to be imprecise in my answer. So if there is something that I don't know, I prefer not to answer. Which might means yes, yeah, may, but I don't want to be pompous and attribute to myself something that I don't know.
Yes. So any other questions, please? You can turn your microphone on and ask questions, just not everybody at the same time. We use this rare opportunity. No? Okay, any questions? One?
It's nearly 2 hours, so perhaps
it's nearly 2 hours. No, I could listen for another 2 with great joy, but I just don't want to delay anybody. I don't want to steal your time.
No, it's fine. I've been happy. Also, it's been for me the opportunity to practice a bit of English again. So
a question came: where have any money have been found? Coins and such.
Yes, not very many, to be honest, and especially not very many from the peak period of San Vincenzo, which is quite a tricky aspect of early medieval archaeology in general. I mean, we know that coins were not very common in this period. There was not a very widespread monetary economy, not just in Italy, but everywhere in Western Europe. And we know that Carolingian coinage was used for certain purposes, such as great commercial transaction, or for they were not used in everyday life. Coins. That is the point. I mean, it's the Carolingian denier, the Carolingian denarius, although made in silver, was as valuable as it would be today a 100 euros banknote or a 200 euros banknote. I mean, you don't go around doing shopping if you have to buy vegetables or you have to buy pasta with 200 euros notes in your pocket. You use coins, you use little, smaller banknotes. The fact is that in the early Middle Ages, they quite simply did not exist. So in the everyday life, coins didn't circulate, and so they were not lost very easily. If they did not circulate, they could not be lost, of course. I mean, it's a quite stupid syllogism from my part, but this is what it is. So unless we were so lucky to find the place where the monks are imagined to have hidden their treasury just before the Arabs arrived and sacked the monastery, we will never find great quantities of coins in San Vincenzo. We know that places like San Vincenzo were literally stuffed with gold, with silver, and with coins made of gold and silver. Especially places like San Vincenzo, who were at the border between an area such as the Byzantine Empire, where the gold used to circulate very commonly, and an area such as the Carolingian Empire, where gold was not circulating anymore. We know from the Chronicle of Monte Cassino that during the 9th century, when the Longobards of Benevento went through a civil war, a very harsh civil war that allowed the Arabs to break in and to become the masters of southern Italy for a while, taking profit of the, of the unstable political situation of southern Italy. We know that the Prince of Salerno went several times to Monte Cassino, obliging the abbot to giving thousands of gold coins in order to pay the expenses of the war. He did so because he considered, as the lord of southern Italy, the monastery of Monte Cassino as something that belonged to him, although he was under the protection of the emperors as well. But I mean, the coins were kept in the treasury of Monte Cassino. There has been studies made by two American scholars, Henry Willard and Armand Citarella. Armand Citarella was, of course, of Italian origins, of Italian offspring, who made a very thorough study of how much goodies were sealed, were kept into the treasury of Monte Cassino during the 9th century, and for how long Monte Cassino could pay off his, protectors and also his ravagers in order not to destroy the monastery. They managed to escape any, a direct attack to the monastery of Monte Cassino because they could pay the Arabs off up to a certain stage. Then eventually in 883, after 2 years after San Vincenzo, also Monte Cassino was sacked and destroyed. But San Vincenzo and Monte Cassino in 875 paid each 3,000 gold coins to the emir of Bari in order to avoid him sacking the monastery. So they had lots of coins, but they were not used for, daily matters.
Question came, actually two different questions. First, is it possible in any way to compare monastery of San Vincenzo al Volturno with the complex of Basilica of San Paul Fiore le Mura and the monastic complex associated with it near Rome?
San Paolo Fiore le Mura was flanked by a Benedictine monastery only in just around the half of the 10th century AD. So it's a bit of a different story. Is the result of the will of Albericus, who was the Lord of Rome in those days, was being considered for a long time as almost like the devil, especially by German historiography. You consider Albericus as the secular Lord of Rome that took Rome into the abyss of secularity, whereas Albericus was a completely different character. He called to Rome the monks of Cluny. He wanted the monastic life of Rome to be reformed and to be, adequated to the standards, to the best standards that were available in Europe. And therefore, he called to St. Paul outside the walls monks led by Cluniac monks, who could then establish a community that could perform monastic life at its best. So it's not completely correct to make a comparison between San Vincenzo and St. Paul outside the wall, although we must consider that from a purely material point of view, St. Paul outside the wall had seen a real small town growing around itself. A burgus, what is called burgus in using the early medieval vocabulary. There were other chapels, there were buildings around the city which were protected by a wall at the end of the 9th century by Pope John VIII, and was rebaptized Johannipolis, the city of John. So in a way, Pope John VIII created a sort of compound around the Basilica of St. Paul, which made it similar to a settlement like San Vincenzo, but its purpose was completely different. I mean, St. Paul was a pilgrimage basilica. San Vincenzo was not. Was a monastery. Only later, this monastic community was established, and it was also a community that should serve the sanctuary. So it was a somehow different context.
You briefly mentioned that there was a detachment of soldiers at the monastery of San Vincenzo al Volturno. Can you a little bit say something about it, or were there weapons found, or how do we know?
Yes, we
found
found
some evidence.
Yes, we found weapons. We know that the monks fought together with their servants when the Arabs arrived. They defended themselves, so they were certainly had weapons by the monastery. A few examples of that have been found during the excavation. The point of a javelot, of an early medieval javelot, was found in the excavations. And we know from examples coming from other monasteries in Europe that monks kept small groups of armed men in order to face possible, problems. For example, the monastery of Centula, which is another great monastery of northern France, had a quarter specifically devoted to hosting men at arms. It was a complex entity. I mean, they needed, you must consider San Vincenzo al Volturno, there could have been more or less 1,000 people living among monks and laymen, plus their families. So it's normal to consider the monks had their guards.
Excellent. Thank you. Any more questions? No? All right. Then what we say, thank you, Dr. Marazzi, for your outstanding presentation.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Number of people, about 5 or 6, already sent me a message. Would it be possible to visit someday? Because I'm organizing trips, and
whenever you wish, we'll be
probably
glad
could meet in person and get personally acquainted and to see all the treasures. And there are people from literally all over. There are from 5 countries at least that I could see that have attended this meeting. So I, from the bottom of my heart, appreciate your time. I did record this, your presentation with your permission. I'll post it under the same link on my Facebook page.
Yes, if you wish, there's no problem.
Yeah, so because some were not able to attend, but certainly wanted, if not for previous commitments, they would have attended. And I surely thank you very much. And
so you will post it on Facebook, basically?
Yes.
Okay, fine. So I can share it on my page as well.
Oh yeah, I'll what do you call it, tag you in the post, so it would go automatically to your page as well. And thank you very much for your kindness, and thank you to you all who came.
Hope to see you in Italy whenever you wish.
Lord willing. Well,
by the way, I don't know if you've ever been there, but in Naples there are the catacombs of San Gennaro as well. They are a perfect counterpart for San Vincenzo, insofar they host a wonderful display of early medieval paintings and early medieval mosaics as well. So if you wish also.
San Gennaro, unfortunately, I haven't been to myself, but San Angelo and Formis I've been 5 or 6 times. So
it's very close to where I live, San Angelo and Formis.
Okay. Well, Lord willing, next time. Well, thank you. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Please keep in touch. We'll have series of various presentations on a weekly basis. So news will be forthcoming on Facebook page. So please keep in touch, and we'll see you soon, Dr. Marazzi. Grazie mille.
Grazie a voi.
Grazie.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Sorry, have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Everybody stay well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.